I learned that a single mistake can silence an entire room faster than the loudest command ever could. The first time I saw Damien Moretti, I did not know his name. I only noticed the strange stillness that followed him as he entered the grand ballroom of the Astoria Grand Hotel in Manhattan. Hundreds of guests filled the elegant space, yet every conversation softened into whispers as though the air itself had decided to step aside. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. White orchids covered every table exactly the way I had arranged them only hours before. I was just the florist hired for the evening, a plus-size woman who spent more time talking to flowers than to wealthy strangers. My cream-colored dress was simple. My beige cardigan still carried the faint scent of fresh roses from my little flower shop in Brooklyn. Nobody noticed me, and honestly, I preferred it that way. I made one last adjustment to the centerpiece near the stage before preparing to leave quietly through the side entrance. That was when everything changed. Damien walked toward the ceremony platform wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that fit him with effortless confidence. His white skin contrasted sharply against the intricate black tattoos that rose above his collar and disappeared beneath the fabric, continuing across his entire body from his neck to his feet. He carried himself without arrogance, yet everyone instinctively gave him space. Some people earned respect. Others demanded it. Somehow, he never needed to do either. His presence spoke first. Beside him stood an event coordinator holding a velvet cushion with an elegant platinum ring resting in the center. Cameras lifted. Guests smiled. Musicians prepared to begin the formal presentation celebrating a charitable family foundation. I had no reason to remain, but one of the floral arrangements near the platform leaned slightly to the left. I stepped forward, hoping to straighten it before anyone noticed. At that exact moment, the coordinator stumbled after catching her heel on the edge of the carpet. The velvet cushion tilted unexpectedly. The platinum ring rolled across the polished surface before, stopping directly beside my feet. Without thinking, I bent down and picked it up. I only wanted to return it before anyone became embarrassed. Damien reached out at precisely the same moment. Our timing could not have been worse. He assumed I was the woman standing beside him for the presentation. I assumed he simply wanted the ring back. Before either of us realized the misunderstanding, he gently took my left hand with calm confidence and slid the platinum ring onto my finger. Silence. Absolute silence. The orchestra stopped playing in the middle of a note. Camera flashes froze. Every face in the ballroom turned toward us. I looked down at the ring sparkling beneath the chandelier light, convinced my mind had misunderstood what had just happened. Damien remained equally still. His gray eyes shifted from the ring to my face as realization slowly replaced certainty. Someone quietly whispered, "That is not the right woman." Another voice echoed from somewhere behind us. "Who is she?" I slowly withdrew my hand, careful not to make the moment more uncomfortable than it already was. My heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. Yet strangely, I did not feel frightened. I felt sorry for him. A mistake this public could happen to anyone. Damien inhaled slowly, maintaining remarkable composure despite the astonished crowd surrounding us. He looked directly into my eyes, searching for anger, embarrassment, or accusation. Instead, he found something entirely different. I smiled gently. "I think this belongs to your evening," I said softly, raising my hand toward him. "Not mine." For the first time in what was probably many years, the most powerful man in the room had absolutely no idea what to say. I expected embarrassment to spread through the ballroom after such an unbelievable mistake, but what happened next surprised me even more. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Hundreds of people simply waited for Damien Moretti to decide what reality would become. The platinum ring still rested on my finger, catching tiny reflections from the crystal chandeliers above us. I gently slipped it off and held it in my open palm before offering it back to him. "Thank you," I said quietly. "But this belongs with your ceremony, not with me." Damien looked at the ring for several long seconds without reaching for it. His gray eyes remained fixed on mine, studying my expression as though he expected to discover hidden ambition behind my smile. Instead, he found only calm sincerity. Finally, he accepted the ring with slow, careful movements. "Miss," he began. "Olivia Carter," I answered. "I own Carter Florals in Brooklyn. My job here was arranging the flowers, nothing more." A faint murmur passed through the audience. Some guests glanced at one another with visible confusion. Others quietly lowered their phones after realizing this extraordinary moment had never been part of the evening's schedule. Damien nodded once. "Miss Carter, you have my sincere apology." His voice carried steady confidence, yet I noticed something unexpected beneath it. Genuine regret. I smiled gently. There is no reason to apologize. Accidents happen. The event coordinator finally recovered enough to step forward, visibly embarrassed. "Sir, the presentation is ready whenever you are." Damien looked toward the stage, then back at me. "One moment." The simple response surprised everyone. Powerful people were rarely expected to interrupt carefully planned events for an ordinary florist. Yet that was exactly what he did. "Miss Carter," he continued, "please allow me to compensate you for the inconvenience." I quietly shook my head. There was no inconvenience. Anthony Brooks, the impeccably dressed man standing beside Damien, opened a slim leather portfolio. "We would be happy to arrange a payment for your time." I laughed softly, hoping to ease the growing tension. I was already paid for the flowers. Anthony remained perfectly professional. "Additional compensation. For what?" I asked kindly. "For surviving an awkward moment." A few nearby guests smiled despite themselves. Even Anthony seemed momentarily uncertain how to respond. Damien surprised everyone again by smiling ever so slightly. It transformed his serious expression in a way I doubted many people had ever witnessed. "You handled this with remarkable grace," he admitted. "That deserves acknowledgement." I folded my hands together. "Respectfully, Mr. Moretti, kindness should never require payment." His smile disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence. I could almost see the sentence settling into his mind. Around us, the ballroom slowly began breathing again. Musicians quietly adjusted their instruments. Waitstaff resumed serving sparkling water. Conversations returned in cautious whispers. Yet despite the movement surrounding us, Damien did not seem interested in continuing the ceremony until our conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "Most people," he said carefully, "would have taken advantage of this situation." I shrugged lightly. "Perhaps, but I have never wanted something that belonged to someone else." My answer lingered between us. Anthony glanced toward Damien before quietly closing the leather portfolio without removing a single document. No payment was offered again. Damien carefully placed the platinum ring back onto the velvet cushion himself before handing it to the coordinator. "Continue with the foundation presentation," he instructed calmly. She nodded with visible relief and hurried toward the stage. I stepped backward, hoping to disappear into the crowd before attracting any more attention. Just as I reached the edge of the ballroom, Damien spoke once more. "Miss Carter." I turned. "Yes." He walked toward me, stopping at a respectful distance. "May I ask you one question?" "Of course." "Why did you smile?" I blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the question. "Because I realized you were probably more embarrassed than I was." For the first time that evening, Damien looked genuinely speechless. I offered one last polite smile before picking up my floral tool bag. "I hope the rest of your event goes perfectly." Without waiting for another reply, I turned and walked toward the grand exit beneath the towering white orchids. I never looked back because I believed the evening had finally ended. I did not know that behind me, Damien quietly instructed Anthony to postpone every remaining meeting on his calendar the following morning. There was suddenly one ordinary florist in Brooklyn he needed to understand, and for reasons he could not yet explain, that seemed more important than everything else waiting for him. I used to believe flowers revealed the truth about people long before words ever could. The morning after the unforgettable ceremony, Carter Florals opened exactly at 8 o'clock, just as it had every weekday for the past 6 years. Fresh sunlight poured through the front windows, warming rows of white lilies, lavender, and eucalyptus. The familiar scent settled my thoughts, yet my mind kept drifting back to the platinum ring and the quiet expression Damien Moretti wore after I refused his offer. I told myself the strange evening was already becoming nothing more than an unusual story I would laugh about one day. Life had a way of returning to ordinary if you simply gave it enough time. My first customer, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Harrison, arrived carrying the same baseball cap he wore every Friday morning. He smiled warmly as I wrapped a bouquet of yellow daisies for his wife. 43 years, he said proudly. She still says flowers work better than expensive gifts. I laughed softly. She sounds like a wise woman. After he left, I swept a few fallen petals from the wooden floor and began arranging white orchids for another wedding scheduled that weekend. Outside, Brooklyn moved at its usual pace. Delivery trucks rumbled past the storefront. Children laughed on their way to school. Nothing suggested my life had quietly become the subject of someone else's attention. Across the street, however, a black luxury sedan remained parked beneath a row of maple trees. Anthony Brooks sat behind the wheel while Damien occupied the rear seat, watching the flower shop through the partially lowered window. She has greeted every customer by name, Anthony observed while glancing at a notebook resting on his lap. She has also given away 3 bouquets without accepting payment. Damien continued watching through the glass. An elderly woman had entered carrying a damaged ceramic vase. Olivia carefully repaired the arrangement, added fresh flowers, and refused every dollar the customer tried to offer. Does she always do that? Damien asked quietly. Anthony nodded. According to the shop owner next door, almost every week. Damien remained silent. Wealth had introduced him to countless generous donations announced beneath bright lights and television cameras. Quiet generosity performed when nobody was watching felt entirely different. 20 minutes later, a young boy entered the flower shop carrying a handful of loose coins. Through the large front window, Damien watched Olivia kneel until they were nearly the same height. She counted the coins together with the child before smiling warmly and handing him a small bouquet wrapped in simple brown paper. The boy hugged the flowers against his chest before running happily toward the sidewalk. Olivia never counted the missing dollars. She simply smiled and waved goodbye. Anthony noticed Damien's thoughtful expression. Would you like a complete background report? Damien answered without taking his eyes off the shop. No financial investigations. No surveillance beyond today. I want facts, not assumptions. Anthony looked mildly surprised. Understood. A few minutes later, Olivia stepped outside carrying a watering can. She carefully watered several flower boxes beneath the shop windows before noticing a struggling street musician attempting to tune an old acoustic guitar nearby. Without hesitation, she disappeared back inside and returned carrying a bottle of cold water and a paper bag. She handed both to the musician with a warm smile before returning to work as though the moment required no recognition. Damien watched everything in complete silence. Finally, he spoke. Yesterday, she refused influence. Today, she gives away what little she has. Anthony closed his notebook. That combination is uncommon. Damien nodded almost imperceptibly. No. His voice remained calm, but something within it had changed. That combination is unforgettable. Just then, Olivia looked across the street while adjusting a display of white orchids. For a brief second, her eyes met Damien's through the morning sunlight reflecting across the windows. She smiled politely, believing she had simply noticed another parked car in Brooklyn traffic. Then she returned to arranging flowers, completely unaware that the most powerful man she had ever met had spent the entire morning learning that the richest person he knew was someone whose greatest wealth could never be measured in dollars. I always believed that ordinary mornings protected people from extraordinary truths, but that illusion disappeared the moment Damien Moretti stepped through the front door of Carter Florals. The small brass bell above the entrance chimed softly as I finished tying an ivory ribbon around a bouquet of white peonies. I looked up expecting another customer searching for anniversary flowers. Instead, the tall man in the perfectly tailored black suit stood quietly beneath the doorway, sunlight outlining the intricate black tattoos rising above his collar before disappearing beneath the crisp white fabric. His calm gray eyes moved across the flower shop with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. The room suddenly felt smaller, not because of his reputation, but because someone accustomed to grand ballrooms now stood inside a modest neighborhood florist where every wooden shelf had been built by my father years ago. I smiled politely. Good morning. Looking for flowers this time? A faint smile appeared across his face. Perhaps. He stepped farther inside, while Anthony remained respectfully outside near the entrance. Damien glanced toward the handwritten chalkboard listing seasonal bouquets before stopping beside a display of white orchids. These were also at the hotel. I nodded. They are my favorite flower. He gently examined one bloom without touching it. Why? I thought for a moment before answering. Because they stay elegant without asking anyone to notice them. His eyes shifted toward me. That sounds familiar. I laughed quietly. Maybe that is why I like them. Silence settled comfortably between us, broken only by the soft humming of the refrigerator preserving delicate arrangements near the back wall. Damien slowly walked through the shop, noticing framed family photographs hanging beside shelves of watering cans and gardening books. One particular photograph caused him to stop completely. It showed me as a little girl standing beside my parents in front of the flower shop shortly after we first opened. Around my neck hung a tiny silver pendant shaped like an olive branch. Damien stared at the photograph longer than seemed ordinary. "Miss Carter," he asked quietly, "have you always worn that pendant?" I glanced toward the picture. "Not anymore. I lost it years ago." His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Do you remember where?" I smiled apologetically. "I wish I did. My mother always said I cried for 2 days after it disappeared." Damien remained silent. Anthony stepped inside carrying a slim folder. "Sir," he said carefully, "I located the archived photographs you requested." Damien accepted the folder and slowly opened it. Inside rested a faded photograph taken more than 20 years earlier. The image showed a large greenhouse surrounded by blooming white orchids. Several children stood smiling near a young olive tree while adults laughed in the background. My attention drifted toward the photograph almost immediately. Something about it felt strangely familiar. I reached for it without thinking. "May I?" Damien handed it to me without hesitation. As I studied the faded faces, an odd sensation settled over me. I pointed toward the corner of the photograph where a little girl wearing a white sun hat stood partly hidden behind an older woman. Around her neck rested a tiny silver pendant shaped exactly like the olive branch from my childhood picture. My heartbeat slowed. "That necklace," I whispered. "It looks exactly like mine." Damien quietly nodded. "It does." I looked closer at the photograph, unable to explain why my chest suddenly felt tight. The greenhouse, the orchids, the sunlight filtering through old glass. None of it should have meant anything to me. Yet deep inside, a memory seemed to stir just beyond reach, like a forgotten melody I almost recognized. Then I noticed one final detail. Standing several feet away from the little girl was a young boy with bright gray eyes, wearing a neat white shirt and smiling directly toward her. Without understanding why, I spoke before I could stop myself. "I think I knew him once." Damien did not answer immediately. He simply looked at the photograph, then back at me, as though he had just realized the mistaken ring had never been the true beginning of our story at all. I could not stop looking at the faded photograph resting in my hands. The faces were softened by time, yet something inside me refused to believe it was simply an old picture of strangers. My fingertips traced the tiny silver pendant hanging from the little girl's neck. It was identical to the one I had worn throughout my childhood until it mysteriously disappeared. I looked up at Damien, searching his calm expression for an explanation. "Where did you find this?" I asked quietly. He answered without hesitation. "It came from my family's archives. My grandmother kept photographs from every community charity event she organized." I looked back at the image. I remember almost nothing before I was 6 years old. My parents always said we moved several times because of financial problems. They never talked much about those early years. Damien nodded thoughtfully. Memory protects people in unusual ways. Before I could respond, the front door opened and Mr. Harrison stepped inside, carrying an empty glass vase. His cheerful smile appeared the moment he saw me. "Olivia, my wife says those daisies are still beautiful." Then he noticed Damien standing nearby. The elderly man politely tipped his baseball cap. "Good morning." Damien returned the greeting with quiet respect. "Good morning, sir." Mr. Harrison looked between us with a playful smile. "Well, I hope I am not interrupting anything important." I laughed softly. "Only an unexpected conversation." He winked. "Sometimes those become the most important ones." After selecting fresh flowers, he quietly thanked me and walked back toward the sidewalk. Damien watched the exchange with thoughtful eyes. "Everyone seems comfortable here." I smiled. "That is the nicest compliment a flower shop can receive." He glanced around the small store again. "You built something people trust." I folded the photograph carefully before handing it back. Trust grows slowly, just like flowers. Damien accepted the photograph, but did not close the folder. Instead, he removed a small envelope that had clearly aged with the photograph. "There is one more thing." He gently opened the envelope and placed a tiny silver pendant onto the wooden counter between us. My breath caught immediately. It was the olive branch necklace. Every delicate curve matched the one from my childhood photographs. The silver had faded slightly with age, yet I recognized it instantly. My hands trembled as I picked it up. "This cannot be," I whispered. Damien spoke softly. "It was found inside the greenhouse after a children's charity event nearly 20 years ago. My grandmother believed it belonged to one of the children, but nobody ever returned to claim it." I stared silently at the pendant resting in my palm. Without realizing it, I touched the small engraving hidden along the back edge. My heartbeat quickened. Tiny letters slowly came into focus beneath years of wear. "Oh, see. My initials." Tears blurred my vision before I even understood why. My mother had everything engraved, I whispered. Even lunchboxes. Even school supplies. Damien remained completely still, allowing the discovery to belong entirely to me. The flower shop seemed impossibly quiet. Outside, traffic continued through Brooklyn exactly as it always had, unaware that a forgotten piece of someone's childhood had just found its way home. I carefully closed my fingers around the pendant. "Thank you for bringing this back." Damien looked at me with quiet sincerity. "It was never mine to keep." I smiled through grateful tears. Most people would have placed it in a display case or sold it to a collector. He slowly shook his head. "Some things carry value that cannot be measured." I looked directly into his eyes for the first time since he entered the shop that morning. The powerful businessman from the hotel no longer seemed distant. He simply looked like someone searching for answers alongside me. As Anthony stepped inside to quietly remind Damien about an afternoon meeting, Damien never looked away from the pendant resting in my hand. Neither of us realized that recovering a lost necklace was only the first piece of a much larger story, because somewhere inside that forgotten greenhouse, hidden beneath decades of silence, waited one final truth that would change both of our lives forever. I had spent years believing that the smallest objects carried the longest memories, and the silver pendant resting in my hand proved it. After Damien quietly left the flower shop with Anthony, I closed the front door for a few minutes and sat alone behind the wooden counter. Sunlight reflected across the engraved olive branch as I slowly fastened the necklace around my neck again. The cool silver settled against my skin as though it had never truly belonged anywhere else. I closed my eyes, hoping another forgotten memory would return, but only scattered images appeared. White orchids, warm laughter, a greenhouse filled with golden afternoon light, a young boy with gray eyes smiling as he carefully held a watering can that seemed much too large for him. Before I could understand whether the memory was real or imagined, the bell above the door chimed again. Damien had returned alone. He held a simple paper folder instead of the leather portfolio Anthony usually carried. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said calmly. I smiled gently. "You are becoming one of my regular customers." A faint smile crossed his face. That would be a first. He placed the folder on the counter without opening it. I found something else in my grandmother's records. I looked at him curiously. "Another photograph?" He slowly shook his head. "A handwritten journal." My attention immediately settled on the folder. Damien carefully removed several copied pages rather than the original notebook. She documented every community event she organized. She believed memories deserved to survive longer than people. I quietly nodded. He turned to one marked page and gently slid it toward me. My eyes followed the elegant handwriting. The date matched the afternoon shown in the greenhouse photograph. My breathing slowed as I read one sentence aloud. "Today, a little girl named Olivia comforted young Damien after he became frightened during the storm. She gave him her tiny olive branch necklace because she said brave people sometimes need reminders too." I stopped reading. The words echoed through the silent flower shop. I looked at Damien in complete disbelief. "That was us." He nodded slowly. "Yes." I stared at the pendant resting against my sweater. "I gave it to you." "You did." His voice remained steady. "The storm frightened every child. I remember almost nothing except one girl who smiled while everyone else cried." A strange warmth spread through my chest. Pieces of forgotten childhood slowly connected together. I remembered standing beneath the greenhouse roof while heavy rain danced against the glass above us. I remembered placing the necklace into the hands of a frightened little boy and telling him that olive branches meant peace always returned after storms. I laughed softly through unexpected tears. I completely forgot. Damien looked at me with quiet honesty. I never did. The admission settled between us without embarrassment. It carried no expectation, only truth preserved by time. I looked around the flower shop as if seeing it differently for the first time. So the ring. Damien finished my sentence before I could. Was only the second time our paths crossed. We both smiled at the remarkable coincidence. Just then Anthony entered carrying his tablet, clearly hesitant to interrupt. Sir, the board meeting begins in 30 minutes. Damien glanced toward him before calmly answering, reschedule it. Anthony blinked once. Again. Damien nodded. Again. Anthony quietly accepted the instruction without another question and stepped back outside. I looked at Damien with amused surprise. People must not tell you no very often. He smiled. You have told me no several times already. Has that been difficult? I asked playfully. He considered the question before answering. No. It has been refreshing. We shared an easy laugh that felt completely natural despite coming from two entirely different worlds. Outside, clouds slowly gathered above the Brooklyn streets, reminding me of the storm described inside the journal. I touched the pendant once more and realized that destiny had not returned a necklace to me. It had quietly returned a promise made by two children who had forgotten each other for decades, while somehow remembering exactly how kindness was supposed to feel. Some people spend their entire lives searching for the reason certain strangers feel familiar, but I had discovered mine inside an old journal written by someone who believed kindness deserved to be remembered forever. Over the following weeks, life settled into a rhythm neither Damien nor I had expected. He never arrived with an announcement or a procession. Most mornings he walked into Carter Florals alone, wearing simple dark clothing beneath a tailored coat, his intricate tattoos visible above the collar that no longer seemed intimidating once I understood the quiet heart behind them. He never asked for special treatment. Instead, he ordered flowers for hospitals, community centers, retirement homes, and schools without attaching his name to a single delivery. At first I assumed he wanted privacy because of his public reputation. Later I realized he simply believed generosity did not become more valuable because someone applauded it. One rainy afternoon, I finally asked him the question that had remained in my thoughts for days. Why do you never tell anyone those donations come from you? Damien looked toward the rain sliding down the front window before answering. Because the flowers are supposed to comfort them, not advertise me. His answer stayed with me long after the conversation ended. I smiled. Your grandmother would probably approve. He nodded gently. Everything I am trying to become started with something she once taught me. I placed fresh lavender into a bouquet while watching him carefully trim the stems of white roses with surprising patience. And what was that? He glanced toward me. Power is easy to notice. Character usually grows where nobody is looking. I quietly laughed. That sounds exactly like something written inside that journal. He smiled without denying it. Just then the front door opened, and a young woman entered carrying a little girl no older than 6. The child clutched a faded drawing of colorful flowers while hiding shyly behind her mother's shoulder. Excuse me, the woman said softly. My daughter has been recovering at the children's hospital. She wanted to thank the person who keeps sending flowers every week. I looked toward Damien, but he simply continued arranging the roses as though he had heard nothing. The little girl walked closer and held out the drawing toward me. These are for the flower lady, she whispered. I accepted the drawing with both hands. This is beautiful. The mother smiled gratefully. Those bouquets have brightened every treatment day. We never knew who sent them. Before I could answer, Damien quietly picked up a small arrangement of cheerful sunflowers and placed it into the child's hands. These belong with your drawing, he said kindly. The little girl's face lit up with pure happiness. Thank you, mister. She hugged the bouquet before leaving with her mother, never realizing the quiet man beside the counter had been the anonymous donor all along. After the door closed, I looked at Damien with admiration. You could have told them. He slowly shook his head. The smile was enough. I realized then that the man the world described through headlines and whispered stories existed only on the surface. The person standing beside me had spent weeks proving himself through quiet actions instead of impressive words. Later that evening, Anthony arrived carrying several folders. He waited until I finished helping a customer before speaking. Sir, the foundation board has approved your proposal. Damien thanked him. Anthony then turned toward me with a respectful smile. Miss Carter, the community greenhouse your family once visited is scheduled for demolition next month. My heart sank immediately. Demolition? Anthony nodded. The property has been abandoned for years. Damien looked thoughtfully toward the rain outside before speaking with complete certainty. Not anymore. Both Anthony and I looked at him. Damien folded the approval papers and placed them back inside the folder. Instead of replacing it, we will restore it. I blinked in surprise. That building has been empty for decades. He met my eyes with calm confidence. Then it has waited long enough. For the first time since finding the pendant, I understood that destiny had never been trying to return us to the past. It had quietly been preparing both of us to rebuild something beautiful. Together, beginning in the very place where two children once learned that even the smallest act of kindness could survive longer than time itself. The day we unlocked the gates of the old greenhouse, it felt less like opening an abandoned building and more like waking a memory that had been sleeping for decades. Morning sunlight streamed through cracked glass panels, painting soft patterns across the dusty stone floor. Vines had climbed along forgotten beams, and rows of empty planting beds stretched toward the far wall where white orchids had once flourished. I stood quietly beside Damien, while the cool spring air carried the scent of fresh soil and distant rain. He looked around without saying a word, his gray eyes taking in every weathered corner. The tattoos rising above the collar of his dark shirt contrasted with the gentle care in his expression as he bent down and lifted a fallen clay flower pot from the ground. "It is still beautiful," I whispered. Damien nodded slowly. "It simply needs someone to believe that." Volunteers began arriving throughout the morning. Local families, retired gardeners, teachers, students, and neighbors walked through the gates carrying gloves, watering cans, and gardening tools. Nobody had been promised recognition. They came because they had heard a forgotten place had been given another chance. Anthony quietly coordinated deliveries while pretending he was not enjoying himself. Even he smiled when several children insisted on showing him where they planned to plant sunflowers. Watching them laugh beneath the old glass ceiling stirred another forgotten memory inside me. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and suddenly remembered running through the greenhouse as a little girl while an older woman gently reminded every child to walk instead of race. I remembered someone laughing nearby. I remembered a frightened little boy smiling after I placed my necklace into his hands. When I opened my eyes again, Damien was standing beside me. "Another memory?" he asked softly. I nodded. More than before. He looked toward the center of the greenhouse, where workers carefully removed broken wooden benches. I remember my grandmother telling me that places remember kindness long after people leave. I smiled. Maybe she was right. As the afternoon continued, one section of the greenhouse slowly transformed. Fresh glass replaced shattered windows. New flower beds took shape. Children planted rows of white orchids beside lavender and wildflowers while older volunteers shared stories about the neighborhood from years ago. There was laughter where silence had lived for decades. Just before sunset, Mr. Harrison arrived holding his wife's hand. They carried a small wooden sign wrapped in cloth. "We made something," he said proudly. Together they uncovered the sign and revealed carefully carved words across polished oak. "The greenhouse of second chances." Every volunteer applauded softly. I felt tears gathering again as Damien gently ran his hand across the carved letters. "It fits," he said quietly. Mr. Harrison smiled. "Flowers bloom again after difficult seasons. People can too." Damien looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. There was confidence, but there was also gratitude. "Would you help me with one final thing?" he asked. I nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and removed the same platinum ring that had accidentally landed on my finger weeks earlier. He placed it on the wooden sign instead of offering it to me. "This ring began with a mistake," he said. It reminded me that life cannot always be controlled. I listened without interrupting. He continued calmly. "I do not want it to represent an accident anymore. I want it to represent a choice." He looked toward the volunteers laughing together among the flowers before meeting my eyes once more. "Not today. Not because anyone expects it. Only when the moment feels completely right." My heart filled with quiet peace. I smiled warmly and picked up the ring before placing it gently back into his hand. "Then let us give it the time it deserves." He closed his fingers around the ring and smiled with genuine relief. There was no disappointment between us, only understanding. The first time I had returned the ring because it belonged to someone else's ceremony. This time I returned it because I believed the future should never be rushed. As the sun settled beyond the greenhouse roof, children watered the first newly planted orchids beneath the golden light. I realized the greatest surprise had never been a misplaced ring or a forgotten necklace. It was discovering that two people could spend years walking separate roads, only to find that kindness had quietly been guiding both of them toward the very same garden all along. People often believe that destiny arrives with thunder, but I learned it usually enters quietly, disguised as an ordinary choice made with an honest heart. Nearly 1 year passed after the greenhouse reopened. Every season left its own colors behind. Spring filled the pathways with white orchids and lavender. Summer welcomed families carrying picnic baskets beneath flowering vines. Autumn covered the gardens with warm golden leaves. Even winter brought beauty as evergreen branches framed the old glass walls with quiet elegance. The greenhouse of second chances became more than a restored building. It became a place where neighbors celebrated weddings, honored anniversaries, welcomed newborn children, and remembered loved ones surrounded by living beauty instead of sorrow. Carter Florals continued serving Brooklyn every morning, but now fresh flowers also traveled from the greenhouse to hospitals, schools, retirement homes, and shelters every single week. Nobody placed names on the cards. Kindness had never needed a signature. Damien visited almost every afternoon when his schedule allowed. Despite leading an extraordinary life filled with responsibility, he always found time to water orchids beside children, help elderly volunteers carry flower pots, or quietly repair wooden benches that had weathered another season. People recognized him, of course, but inside the greenhouse he was simply another pair of willing hands. That was exactly how he preferred it. One warm Saturday evening, the community gathered to celebrate the greenhouse's first anniversary. Hundreds of tiny string lights glowed above the pathways while musicians played gentle melodies beneath the restored glass ceiling. Families laughed together. Children proudly pointed toward flowers they had planted. Months earlier, Mr. Harrison and his wife danced slowly near the central fountain, while Anthony somehow allowed several neighborhood children to convince him to judge a sunflower growing contest. Watching everyone together filled my heart with a peace I had never imagined possible. As sunset painted the sky with shades of amber and rose, Damien quietly approached me carrying a small wooden box. There was no stage waiting nearby, no photographers, no audience expecting a performance. Only blooming orchids, familiar laughter, and the people whose lives had quietly become connected through one forgotten greenhouse. He smiled with the same calm warmth I had come to treasure. "Do you remember what you told me the night we first met?" he asked. I laughed softly. "You will have to be more specific." His gray eyes reflected the evening light. "You said kindness should never require payment." I nodded. I still believe that. He gently opened the wooden box. Inside rested the same platinum ring, waiting patiently exactly as it had for an entire year. "You were right," he said quietly. "Kindness cannot be purchased. Trust cannot be rushed. Love cannot be scheduled." He took a slow breath before continuing. "But sometimes life gives us another opportunity after we have learned enough to appreciate it." My eyes filled with grateful tears as he carefully held the ring between his fingers. "Olivia, you changed my understanding of strength long before either of us remembered meeting as children. You reminded me that the greatest influence comes from compassion, not control. You helped me become the man I always hoped I could be. If you believe our journey should continue together, I would be honored to spend every season beside you." The greenhouse became wonderfully quiet. Nobody interrupted the moment. Even the children seemed to sense something beautiful was unfolding. I looked at the ring before meeting his eyes. Then I smiled exactly as I had on the night everything unexpectedly began. "Yes," I whispered. "This time it belongs here." Damien gently placed the ring on my finger. It no longer felt like a mistake searching for the right owner. It felt like a promise that had patiently waited until two people were finally ready to understand its meaning. Warm applause slowly filled the greenhouse as friends and neighbors celebrated around us. Mr. Harrison quietly wiped away happy tears while Anthony smiled more openly than I had ever seen before. Above us, white orchids swayed gently beneath the evening breeze drifting through the open windows. I rested my hand against the silver olive branch pendant still hanging around my neck and realized the necklace had taught us our first lesson as children, while the ring had taught us the final one as adults. Some treasures are lost, so they can be found again. Some paths separate, so they can return stronger than before. And sometimes the greatest surprise is not that destiny finds you, but that it quietly waits until your heart is ready to recognize it.